Can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. Hello, hi. Again, my name is Joseph Mizhakiiyaasige Zordan, and I'm a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at Harvard University. As an enrolled member of the Bad River Ojibwe, to give acknowledgement to the Indigenous relatives whose lands we meet upon, I offer these words in a brief reintroduction of myself in Ojibwe. Joseph Indigeneity Mizhakiiyaasige Anishinaabe Wizalwin, Migizindodem, Mashki Zibi Minawa Miskwapikang and Donjiba. Ni mawidishua o ma o dom minawa pipash inamwagana doga king ni minogishika o ma minawa nujidog minawa inamwagana dog minawa adatzokanonic mikwich. I also want to take this moment to extend the thank yous that many of my co-presenters have. Thank you to Scott Stephen Manning and Ruben Espinoza for the invitation to join such esteemed company. It is a great honor to be here. Thank you as well to the rest of the organizing committee and the board of Race Before Race and all the hands behind the scenes who made this trip possible. I also, of course, want to thank my co-presenters at this gathering. Thank you for sharing your brilliance and so many remarkable stories of Indigenous resistance, beauty, and so much else. I also want to take this moment to just, again, also reiterate the what feels like the increased importance of this kind of gathering and the political times we find ourselves within. Now is the time to come together to talk and to discuss the very things that make us us, the way that history and the shadow is never far from us, and the way in which we can move forward together in a way better than we have before. Along those lines, I also want to acknowledge that the world and the events I'm talking about today will include instances of violence against women, children, Indigenous people, and basically any other kind of person, you can imagine. And so, with this in mind, let us begin. In the aftermath of a now long infamous French and Allied Indigenous raid upon the small farming community of Deerfield, Massachusetts in February of 1704, wherein half of the town's buildings were destroyed, 112 mostly English settlers were taken captive, and 48 inhabitants across ages and genders were killed. In the midst of this violence, a seemingly unlikely object came to memorialize these events. A door, marked by the hatchet of probably an Indigenous combatant attempting to break into the family home of Ensign John Sheldon during the attack on the frontier town. This architectural fragment, long since in the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association, or the PVMA's collection, it is now more a memorial than anything functional. Removed from the home it was once a part of, and this is its current installation. The door is now perpetually closed, yet somehow still open, bearing an unhealing wound which still bleeds the memory of an event that in many ways the town has never quite recovered from. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the raid, the town reached international attention, even in the 18th century, with the events in the aftermath of the attack since holding a lasting place in our understandings of the town, colonial histories, and later even America's self-mythologizing. Countless books, papers, conferences, sermons, reenactments, and yes, actually, even action figures, there we go, have been produced in the wake of this raid to commemorate the events of extreme violence. Yeah, and I also, just really quickly, this is about as light as this presentation is gonna get. So I appreciate I think the thing I most appreciate about this is, despite it being American heroes, it actually doesn't necessarily say who the hero is. Yeah, so I think we'll just keep that in mind in the course of this presentation. But even despite of the mountains of words and kitsch which has developed around this event of mass violence in the centuries since its happening, the door with its direct inscription, its registration of the event of violence itself, and its subsequent preservation across generations, I believe has much to offer our conversation today, certainly more than the action figures, though this may be debatable. As Indigenous studies has continued to expand and receive much deserved attention and nuances, as this and so many other conferences have demonstrated, the identity which indigeneity is so often placed in binary construction with or complementarity, the settler, has largely gone unaddressed and unnuanced. In part because it is so often is constructed as something so self-evident, right? A duck is a duck, a settler is a settler. However, I believe that in looking more closely at the subject position and its construction, a much more complex story can arise. One which does not simply reiterate the inevitability of contact as conquest, nor necessarily ascribe indigenous and settler into the familiar and easy categories of victim and perpetrator, doer and done to borrow words from the psychoanalyst analyst Jessica Benjamin, and so on and so forth. The door, being entirely embedded in one such complex story, provides us ample room to explore these nuances within the settler context, especially when we put it to questions which denaturalize the position of the settler. Who exactly was a settler? What did it mean to be a settler in the 17th century? And was there such a thing of a settler identity that we can consider distinct from European identity? And I think this is kind of the crux of this project. By looking through and staying with the violence which the door opens to, I believe we will find that it not only gestures towards answers to these questions, but also even broader ones, with implications not only for our understanding of colonial history, but Indigenous studies as well. But in order to undertake this work, we must first gain a better understanding of what exactly the frontier was in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and Deerfield's place within it. And to do that, we must at least metaphorically return the door to its hinges. By the time John Sheldon moved to Deerfield, the door had already seen its fair share of colonial life, both mundane and violent. So this is where Deerfield is on a map. Well, the township was officially established in 1673. The land had been purchased by British land speculators who lived in Dedham, Mass. A few years earlier from the Pocumtuck peoples, or at least a Pocumtuck person, after being displaced from the area during the Mohawk-French Wars of 1640. With the land's proximity to the Connecticut River, it promised to be fertile farmland, a valuable asset as the European population on Turtle Island continued to grow, and something already proven by various other frontier towns along the river valley that it could continue to sustain such growth. Those who most often moved to such frontier towns, distant from the more secured towns and cities along the coast, were generally young families or single men who quickly married after arriving, with little means themselves, eager to find a place to call home and to start their own lives in earnest out of their parents' shadows and often rapidly dwindling farmlands. Deerfield was no exception to this rule, and the village would reach a population of 200 less than a decade after its original purchase. At the beginning, Deerfield residents enjoyed relatively unremarkable interactions with their Indigenous neighbors, often trading with them. Often they would pass through town and not necessarily even minding the sporadic gatherings between nations near its grounds, as Deerfield had often been, and its surrounding land had often been a meeting place prior to its sale. However, this relatively lax relationship for both parties changed during King Philip's War. During the conflict, Deerfield and many other English frontier towns became too dangerous for the residents and too costly for the British to continue to hold. In 1675, after 2 attacks during which 14 men were killed, the Massachusetts legislature ordered Deerfield to be evacuated and abandoned by settlers, after which the land was reclaimed by the Pocumtuck peoples, which they almost immediately returned to traditional stewardship practices as they sowed corn with hopes of harvest ahead. This hope, however, would not come to pass, and not long after, their reoccupation of the land would come to the end, and the land was vacated again. It would continue to be a much disputed outpost passing between hands until British control reached solidity in 1682, when it was finally approved for the repopulation of its former inhabitants. While some former Deerfield residents had decided to seek out more predictable lives than one on the frontier, members from all 18 of the original families moved back to their respective homes and farmlands and returned to work shortly after its reclamation by the British Empire. In time, new families too would join, among them the proprietor of our door, John Sheldon, in 1692. In the wake of such violence and a greater awareness of the vulnerability that came with life on the frontier, the British state realized its need to intervene should its project of expansion and control of its costly colonies continue. As a result, a variety of administrative decisions were made by Massachusetts legislature, primarily to discourage settlers from leaving the frontier after arriving there. New residents to Deerfield, such as Sheldon, were granted land with the stipulation that they would not leave for a minimum of 3 years. They had to stay within the town. If residents of any variety wanted to leave or evacuate their homestead, they would have to first petition the Massachusetts legislature for permission, else they risked having their property forfeited to the state. In 1695, in part due to the 9 Years' War and the British desire to hold valuable positions closer to French territory, such legal and economic discouragements to abandon settlements became even more codified, with new legislation passing which reiterated the possibility of forfeitures of land as well as imprisonment for non-landowners should they leave without first obtaining the said license to exit the frontier. Even then, some families did leave, but others remained. And after all, it was not only the legal hazards that were part of maintaining the psychic architecture necessary to sustain colonialism on the frontier. Influential preachers, too, played a role in its continuation, especially as frontier towns were often known for being more religious than their urban counterparts. When most Deerfield residents chose not to abandon their town during the 9 Years' War, for example, despite 12 townspeople being killed, 5 wounded, and 5 captured, they found their resistance to exiting this land publicly praised. Writing in 1699, the influential Puritan preacher Cotton Mather said of the townspeople as being an extraordinary instance of courage in keeping their station, though they have lived all this whole in a very Pithariath, or like a place, he's referencing the Bible and Moses' Exodus. Their worthy pastor, Mr. John Williams, deserves the thanks of all this province for his encouraging them all the ways imaginable to stand their ground. Pulled from Mather's book entitled Decade of Sorrow, wherein he spends considerable time extolling how towns attacked or British settlers who were taken captive was a sign of their sinfulness, of God's wrath, rather than really necessarily mentioning any other aspect of their presence in the land. But the thing I really want to stay in with this quote is how, right, the act of staying becomes an act of godliness. And interestingly, it does not occlude the reality that the frontier was unstable and uncertain, but even so, Mather manages to produce staying as a moral issue, a religious issue, occluding its political nature almost entirely, particularly in his omission of the legislation produced to ensure people stayed in place and the garrisons dispatched to the town to ensure their continuation during times of need. But while such words obscure the architecture of the town did not lie. And honesty, well evident in the Sheldon house, which John would construct in 1698. Whenever able, settlers, especially those who were able to gain particular cultural and social capital within the small towns of which they were a part, would often take great effort to create fortified homes, complete with thick walls, carefully placed windows, and of course, a strong door. While only made of pine, this entry to the Sheldon house had been reinforced first by alternating the planks' orientation on each side of the door, so exterior vertical? Yeah, vertical, interior, horizontal. And secondly, by the insertion of iron nails on the exterior, vastly reducing the effectiveness of hatchets, something which would prove to be rather important during the events ahead. Here, in this object, settler anxiety of the outside takes its most direct material form through this threshold object. Made years before being the subject to any real violence, the door in many ways marks a deep awareness of the ever-present potential for violent encounters, and in turn a clear indication that such frontier towns were not unaware of their own positions as tenuous, as their own position as outposts to a project much bigger to themselves that they could not necessarily control. And indeed, the town, not long after this home's construction, would find itself embroiled in something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. The French-led military operation, the Deerfield Raid, fell upon the town in the quiet of dawn on February 29, 1704. The expedition had been launched as part of the American theater of the War of the Spanish Succession, referred to as Queen Anne's War, and as a means to solidify French relationships to a wide range of Indigenous allies and trade partners, while weakening valuable British positions along the frontier and borderlands between the two colonial powers. The party consisted of roughly 250 Indigenous soldiers from a variety of nations, including the Abenaki, Mohawk, Wendat, Pecumtuck, and Pennacook, along with 48 French soldiers. In a coordinated effort, which quickly fell into chaos nonetheless, in part because of the massive size and the competing claims for military commanding of the effort, the men still attempted to try to produce a similar formation they had in previous such raids, wherein they would enter the town in the quiet of night, break off into smaller groups with the intention of simultaneously breaking into as many homes as possible to overtake and surprise the town's inhabitants before being able to respond. By the time the party reached the Sheldon house on the opposite side from where the raid began, the residents were wide awake and had barred the reinforced door. This act, while simple, managed to buy valuable time for the family. While the raiders struggled to find a point of entry, John Sheldon Jr. and John Sheldon Sr. had managed to escape. Hannah, John Jr.'s wife, had also tried to escape with her husband, though the jump from the second-story window had sprained her ankle. Still, she bid her husband to move on to Hatfield, 13 miles south, to get help, which he did manage to do. In time, raiders had managed to cut a hole large enough to orient the barrel of a gun from the outside, from which they shot and killed Hannah Sheldon, John Sheldon Sr.'s wife, still inside the home with the 4 remaining Sheldon children. Meanwhile, a separate group of raiders had gone around the corner and broken in through the back door, notably a door that has not been saved, and began the process of taking the remaining residents captive: Mary, Ebenezer, Remembrance, and Mercy. Determined to be unlikely to survive a journey to Canada, then 2-year-old Mercy Sheldon was taken and killed just outside her family's home on the still freshly fallen snow that soon 112 of her family, friends, and other residents of the town, as well as their captors, would traverse on a long journey to French Canada and various Indigenous homelands to be held for ransom, integrated into new families, or killed. While, for the sake of time, I will not go much further into the events of the raid itself or even its aftermath, I ask that we instead stay with the door in this home a bit longer. Undoubtedly, the Sheldon family, the door of their home, and the town had all been altered in the same way. Inscribed by frontier violence, which they so keenly were aware of being at risk of, but nonetheless could not escape, in time, many of those held captive would return to their home in Deerfield, others would not, finding new family among their captors, with the most famous of which being Eunice Williams, who integrated into the Mohawk community she was taken to. Nonetheless, it is in this encounter, however, that the settler home as a self-aware technology of the frontier becomes the most realized. It was constructed to withstand an attack, or in the very least stall those to come in for as long as possible, to reject the outside for as long as possible, which is arguably possibly one of the more important parts of settler psychic life, right? The rejection of place and indigeneity and so much else. Nonetheless, because of this fortified rejection, some of those within the home did manage to escape, including Ensign John Sheldon, who during his life would make 3 separate trips to Canada to try to regain those residents taken captive. Over the course of these trips, he would be reunited with all 3 of his remaining children and his daughter-in-law Hannah, while also returning 113 other British captives to New England. While doing this diplomatic work, John continued to live in his home and did not replace the front door, simply adding another slat of wood on the interior to stop the flow of the inside coming in. It is hard not to imagine his interactions with this object every day, from work to home, bearing a scar of loss itself, much like his own, from the loss of his wife and young daughter. But in the very least, the door and its materiality and wooden memory made the loss something he could touch, an absence which had shape, an absence to be lived with, a tangible sorrow. Here in the place of entry and exit, I believe we find how the individual settler confronts the bigger project they are a part of, In many ways, both the door and the individual settler themselves are threshold objects in between and deployed for the protection of what remains within, but still liable to fail or arguably designed to fail. Indeed, I would go so far to say it is not the home, which is the settler technology par excellence in this example, but in fact the failed home, which brings the individual deeper into vulnerability and paranoia, away from the world around them, and into the defensive rhetoric so often repeated today among those attached to the settler identity upon which America was founded. Indeed, something even more obvious when one sees how such attacks also led to an influx of capital, more soldiers, more people, more garrisons, and so much else to these small farming communities that also served a much greater purpose, obviously. The door in the story would continue to be passed down for generations, but even so, the whole, from where the outside world could no longer be denied, too, took a social form as much as a literal one. Those held captive and who returned would develop a range of relationships to indigeneity and indigenous people, with some, including even the Sheldons, occasionally hosting members of the indigenous families which once held them captive. Whether these relationships were reparative is difficult to say, but nonetheless gestures towards the complex social formations which were in flux at the 17th century, as even in paranoia, and indeed some would go on to stake their claims as Indian hunters, essentially, there was a certain intimacy which arose that, at least for now, escapes words. To conclude, I believe that the history I've offered for our conversation today on its face may seem odd for this conference. What does it mean to stay with this point of reversal, to include the great number of atrocities which the British had enacted leading up to this moment, atrocities which are important to understand and know and stay with in much the same way? Indeed, it may be uncomfortable, especially after so many fantastic papers, as I've mentioned earlier, which have deservedly centered indigenous peoples and cultures, and I understand this. But to this end, I respond that this work comes out of my own experience as an Anishinaabeg person, first and foremost, and an American art historian second. After working so closely with the historic works of my own people, with thinking deeply with their own histories of generosity and reciprocity, and maybe my last page, I found myself dogged by a question. Why would anyone want to be a settler? And additionally, why would anyone willingly put their loved ones at such risk that comes with the project of settler colonialism? These questions on their risk may seem asinine, silly, so many other things, but I see it first and foremost as a desire to better understand the systems of violence which have so often shaped our lives. And staying with the inscription, the violence of the inscription of this object, I believe we have some answers which fall outside of easier conceptions. The settler is a subject position marked by woundedness as much as wounding. The settler, on the individual level, may have any number of relationships to indigeneity, but still, whether from desire or circumstances, their lives were unfolded in a system much bigger than themselves, a system we know as settler colonialism and all the attendant violence. So staying with this, I end on two questions. What have we made of our grief, and what has our grief made of us? Misago miigwech.
Hi. This is a larger question that I keep seeing in discussion from the last several speakers. You have stated very clearly that the art historian part is secondary in your frame, and this question has kind of come up in several of the other talks. The question of art history and the field of art history.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you want to talk about it or if others, the last, I would say 3 talks in some ways, has sort of offered this question, but then also sort of, we haven't gotten a chance to discuss. So if anyone wants to talk about that, yeah.
That's, thank you so much. That was a really actually lovely question. I feel, right, like questions are best when they point out something you didn't even realize you did. And so I think what I mean by that in this instance relates to what I feel the responsibility of scholarship is and my own kind of life, right? And I think in starting with these kind of community ties and grounding, I feel like it, I feel like, how am I going to say this? I feel like there's some, okay, I'll go back a bit. So I think, right, so this project and my project generally is coming out of my kind of work as an undergraduate working on Indigenous art, and whether I worked for NAGPRA and various other things, and I saw kind of this very relationship-first approach to objects. And it became something that became very important to me, and something we've discussed even with other people here, of just the sense of like how we can move through the kind of humanities in a way that doesn't occlude responsibility. I don't know. I feel like I'm doing a bad job answering this, but I think it's just, I feel like in grounding myself in relationships, I feel like I have the desire to ground historic relationships too, and to really give attention to the individual and the specific, and really think about even just the kind of emotional connections and tethers that kind of float around these objects in very difficult kind of attachments. And I think in kind of starting in a grounded approach in myself, I feel like allows me to maybe go into different paths. Like I don't think this project would come out of, I don't think I would be drawn to this project if I did not feel attached and secure in my attachment to my identity as an Indigenous person. I think that is a completely necessary part of this project, which is why I talk about it. But I think it's also, yeah, like I have a certain toolkit as an art historian. I'm trained as an art historian, I know objects, and I think it's just kind of, yeah, like what can I do from who I am and what my skills are, I think. I don't know. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph, for this paper and reminding us of, especially if you grew up in the Northeast, this was an object I saw fairly often as a young person, partly as a Mohawk, our handiwork.
Yeah.
But that place has changed, and I'm wondering if your work in other ways has followed that, because it was redone completely. And
Yeah.
I've always seen that door as, well, there are enough medievalists here, as a relic.
Yeah.
I mean, settler descendants would travel and want to touch it like it was the Ark or something.
Yeah.
And the name of the site has changed, right? It was the Deerfield Massacre all my growing up.
Yeah.
And then it became the Deerfield Raid not so long ago. And my uncle said, when is it going to just become the Deerfield Event?
Yeah.
You know, because it seemed to be waffling as to where it was. So could you speak to its mutability in this way?
Yeah, I think thank you for that question, Scott. I think part of why I was drawn to this particular object is it feels, just like spending so much time in New England and the Northeast, it was such a recurring object of people mentioning and talking about, and it feels so kind of essential into the construction of a settler identity, which is what I hope I was trying to articulate in this paper. And I think the broader project, I hope to kind of do a little bit more tracking the evolution. This is very fresh research, and I think Right, so like it goes from a door to a broken door and it stays on the house, and then the house itself kind of becomes almost like, even prior to its the production of the PVMA, becomes this kind of like historic pilgrimage people go on, right? So like people, there's at least some narratives of like people going up and like knocking on the house and asking whoever the resident was at the time to tell them the story of the raid. And so I think there's like this very direct relationship that's very place-based that then kind of spirals out as right, like action figures. It's on T-shirts. It's on the town seal. It's on, and then like I think it's that kind of like movement to me is also really just interesting in thinking about like what exactly does America's conception of self hinge upon? And what from its colonial settler past does it see as worthy as being brought into the American identity? And this is a story that even in around 1800 in sermons becomes brought back into memory. So it's a constant kind of reiteration that I think really is just it's just very interesting to me, like why this particular raid, why this door, why these particular things. And I think part of it is the extreme difficulty and violence associated with it, and the fact that people told stories about it. And right, so like John Williams, who is the preacher of the town and who notably was also included in the action figure. He's also one of the first anti-vaxxers, which I learned recently. Right, he writes his like captivity narrative and like all of these things. So I think even just kind of like its relationship and evolution comes from both its like massive kind of explosion into popular consciousness when it starts, and then it just never kind of stops. And it's, yeah, I don't know. That was a very rambling question, but thank you.
Thank you. I've also grown up with this door and this sense of trauma and wound, and seeing it on your slides, I didn't realize how much it looked like a vagina until I saw it there, and now I can't stop thinking about those two senses of wound. But what I want to ask you about, I was teaching a class on settler identity not too long ago, and I had a student in the SRI tell me that they didn't like me calling students settlers, and in fact suggested that this was a slur, equivalent to calling my black students the N-word. And I walked away thinking, no, it's not. Because one, you can say settler, you don't call it the S word. But two, it's really interesting to me that there are a group of people who now find the idea of being called a settler pejorative. And it reminds me so much of what happens in whiteness studies, where some people who are white are really interested in getting into that conversation, but I also find some people who are white are really interested in like self-flatulating themselves for being white. I'm the good white person, I feel so bad about my privilege, that sort of thing. So what I want to ask you is, as we're theorizing settler identity as a wound, as trauma, what is the relationship between that trauma and the privilege of its invisibility? Because my student couldn't have had that reaction unless their identity as a settler were invisible to them until it was brought sort of to the fore.
Yeah, thank you. And that's right, like that's I think part of it is, I often think about how, or at least, I guess, just to respond directly, I feel like part of it's also is just like a kind of immediate rejection of responsibility. So to say like, I have nothing to do with this has no impact on me, and it has nothing to do with the way in which I live, which is not true, obviously. But I think it's also just, I think part of it is also just like we don't, and what I feel personally is that we don't have good enough words yet around what that experience was in specificity and in Also just like kind of where and how we construct the individual to the collective. Because I think something that feels very interesting to me and kind of like spending time and really getting into how Massachusetts legislature was involved in the maintenance of these frontier towns, not through necessarily like perks, but through like you will go to jail. And I think, right, so like I think in thinking about just how this particular identity is attached to something which inevitably cannot be produced by individuals. They can be a part of the system, right? So like and kind of like spending time really thinking about the legislative aspect of this is colonialism is a state crime. It is a crime that takes in the form of bureaucracy, and it cannot necessarily be accomplished without bureaucracy, without these kinds of broader structures that obfuscate its violence, that obfuscate its relationship to individuals and their experiences, and which also can kind of, I don't know, right, like absorb certain experiences to say, oh, this terrible thing happened to you, but don't worry, it's for the greater good, even though the greater good may actually have no impact on this individual's life. And I think we see that certainly today in our current context of American social and political life. But I think just kind of, and right, but of course, like I'm also not saying settlers as on the individual level are completely scot-free either, and I don't want that to be the takeaway of this talk either. But I think just like, yeah, I think this kind of, it's complicated, but it's not complicated. It's a like kind of weird paradox that exists in certain systems that rely on an irrational relationship to the world. And I think that's very much a part of this. Thank you.